Afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it another minute or so for people to join. Looks like we're still missing three. So why don't we give it another minute or two? Abigail, did you happen to hear from anybody if somebody's going to be late or not be able to make it today?
Excuse me. I know John indicated he might be a few minutes late. All right.
Laura was going to try to join us in the car, but I think it depends on her service. She was driving north to New Hampshire and at
That
first thought she wasn't going to be able to make it at all. So,
that's right. Okay. Well, here's Mariana. I think we're just waiting on Steve Zaretti and possibly Laura if she can make it today. And here's Steve. Okay. Okay. About 3 minutes past, so I guess I'm gonna. It looks like somebody else from Save the Sound is coming. Maybe this is
that's
ecological risk.
probably Laura.
Yep, that's probably Laura from the car. So I'm gonna get going here. First off, again, thanks everyone for taking the time this afternoon. We have a number of things that we have on the agenda today, but most of it is very specifically to discuss the policy considerations that have been sent around. I don't really have any remarks from the chair for this particular point, but I will ask for public comment if there is any, just to kick off the meeting. Doesn't look like there is any, so why don't we just jump right into it? I know that oh, I'm sorry, Eric. Go ahead. I didn't see your hand there.
No worries. This doesn't count really as public comment, but just more a comment on if there are members of the public who might be interested in joining us. It's hard to find on the calendar how to actually get to the YouTube live link for folks. So obviously, we all had the Zoom invitation, but people are watching this on YouTube live, but only if they have that link, and it's not currently on the CGA calendar. That has a link to an agenda, but no way to actually join us. So just making that note. I mean, obviously, this will live in YouTube Live, and people could find it afterward. But maybe just for next week's meeting, we want to make sure that that is all in there. Or if for some reason I'm missing that, maybe folks could set me straight. But just want to make sure we have open attendance and opportunity for folks to listen in.
That's helpful, Eric. Thanks for flagging that. I did not notice that. I don't know, Abigail, Kaylee, are you working with the committee as well?
Hi, I'm from Pura.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yep. Welcome. Um, Maybe Abigail, if you're on there, if you could take note of that, maybe next week, possibly we can include it with specifically with the agenda, but also elsewhere on, the CJA calendar and whatnot, so that people can find it a little more easily. I didn't notice that, so go ahead, Duncan.
Here's Duncan again with a mechanical hand. So I always think of myself as a electrically and mechanically inclined guy, but can somebody please tell me how to do the hand? What button is that again?
the reactions button at the bottom there looks like a smiley face with
Reactions.
the,
Got it.
and
Got
then you
it.
could raise hand there.
Okay, thank you. And Eric, very good point that you just brought up in an email to me that on my table, which I've got like the 7th rendition now, there's going to be an 8th rendition because Eric so well pointed out that we really should say policy considerations, not policy recommendations. So I'll fix that and send it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you. All right. Well, with that, I propose we jump right into some of the conversation here. I know that I put it in a not necessarily a specific order, but I would recommend we start off with A and B, which are somewhat related, but I think have different flavors. This is very specifically the hydro tariff as offered by John Petrillo of Gravity Renewables, and also Duncan's hydropower tariff proposal that he's been talking about for some time now over the last few couple of months. So if you're okay with it, John, I might call on you just to kind of describe what your proposal specifically entails.
Sure. Happy to do that, Len. And appreciate the opportunity to put a proposal out here. So essentially what this approach is modeled after a program they have in Rhode Island. And there's a similar program in Vermont as well. It essentially provides generators that meet certain criteria with what boils down to kind of like they call it the last resort service rate. So I think in the context of this conversation, really what this is if a project meets certain criteria, which I think we're still talking about what those are, then they would be eligible for to participate in a contract with a utility for the energy and capacity products that their project provided. The rates are adjusted quarterly. It's essentially an avoided cost rate. So it's what utilities are going out and buying power for. It fluctuates because it is adjusted quarterly. There's a little bit of a downside there from an investor owner's perspective, where you don't have rate certainty. It's a little harder to finance against. But it is better than kind of the alternative right now, which is LMP, which is a little misleading in terms of that value as it's delivered to a generator versus what the utility is actually going out and procuring energy for. So there's a couple of other, I call them, kind of contractual details. Again, a lot of what was in this proposal is really modeled after the Rhode Island example. We'd have to do some adjusting to make it Connecticut specific. And Mariana said, some comments on that, including the Connecticut rates, which are pretty comparable to the last published rates in Rhode Island. And I think that's indicative generally of the cost of energy in the region. So without doing a kind of line by line, I think that's the general gist. I'm not sure if everyone's had a chance to look at the document. Obviously we have, not a ton of time, but plenty of time to kind of look through this. And yeah, I'll just pause and get some feedback.
I might recommend just initially if we want to start off with just very general comments, or we could just jump right into Mariana's questions that she did pose in line in the document earlier to the entire group. I might just ask that we kind of read them out as we're talking about it, so that those watching at home can actually understand what the heck we're talking about. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, just for those who are watching at home, Len, it's good to be thinking about it that way. So folks may not know what LMP is, or if there is a appreciable difference between what we've talked about elsewhere as being like the retail rate, versus the last resort service rate. If there are distinctions like that, it would be helpful to just hear those as you describe it.
Yeah, I might get in over my head on that one, Eric. I do know that LMP is sort of like the instantaneous cost of power as delivered to the wholesale system. But that is not how utilities ensure reliable service. They're going out contracting ahead of time for good chunks of what their delivery obligations are, so that when you go and turn your light switch on, it works. And with cost to contracting, forward like that, it's not to say there aren't some settlements that happen on the real-time market, but that is not what you see in your bill. The LMP over the past several years in Connecticut, if you look at that analysis, kind of discounting the pandemic-related spikes in pricing, was roughly like maybe 3 cents a kilowatt hour. But that is obviously not what you see on your bill. And there's a lot that kind of gets built into that. And essentially what this last resort service is trying to do is bridge that gap a little bit, because that's in the absence of some other program or a bilateral contract, the LMP is what, hydro generators are getting compensated for, or that's the rate they get compensated at. And there's obviously a big difference between, that and what you're seeing on the bill. Len, you might be able to describe this better.
I was just going to add, I mean, I think that generally is pretty solid discussion. I don't think you mentioned it. LMP stands for locational marginal price. And of course, there are various locations throughout New England that the regulator of the ISO New England establishes throughout various periods of time. So, obviously there's Connecticut zones, there's different zones throughout, and it may fluctuate according to a lot of different variables, but generally speaking, yeah, that's kind of how John described it. Is pretty good description.
Yeah, sorry I missed the boat on the acronym. That was the question, and I blew it.
Anybody in the industry is used to so many acronyms. We just it's almost like a second language. So
yeah, it's a little wonky.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, this is Steve Kidwalader from Pure. I just wanted to mention that avoided cost may need to be defined, because I know the utilities look at avoided cost as the cost they can get in the wholesale market, which would be the LMP price. And depending on how the product is bundled, it may or may not be more valuable than that. So I just want to make sure the group understands that, so that if you say avoided cost, you don't lead to this. Is it the wholesale price? Is it some packaged deal that you'd get to serve retail customers? So just wanted to raise that.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great point. Avoided cost has its own whole body of work in defining what that is and how it's calculated. We don't want to create that confusion.
The difficulty with all of this is it is incredibly complex. So so keep us in check if we start getting ahead of what most people would actually be able to understand. Beyond that, I don't know, John, if you'd like to just I don't know if you have it in front of you, if you want to go through Mariana's questions just to kind of start it off.
Yeah, I do. I don't know, Len, do you have it? Do you want to share?
I do have it in front of me. I can read it out unless Mariana wants to.
So people can see it. That might be helpful for.
Oh yeah, that makes sense too.
The YouTube folks.
That totally makes sense. My apologies. Let me find the screen.
Authority to do that. So.
Just bear with me for a second. I gotta find it. Oh, here we go. Okay, I think this is it. Okay, let me know if you can see it.
I see it.
Okay, is it big enough for people to actually be able to see what it says?
I can see it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so Mariana's first comments were on eligibility, and I think, as I alluded to before, this is an area where I believe we just have some further discussion. Then again, this is Model F for Rhode Island. So Rhode Island's rules are, basically if you're a qualifying facility, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has a set of criteria which kind of apply to that type of designation, as well as, being eligible for the Connecticut RPS. I believe that's where, there's some discussion. This group has talked about some modifications to allow to expand the eligibility criteria to allow for certain types of hydropower projects to qualify beyond what's currently in the language. So, Mariana's questions were just about that, whether this would just be specific to hydro or not. And I think that's, kind of open for discussion. The way we've talked about some of the potential modifications to the class 1 language, there would be sort of a new subcategory that was for existing hydro that met certain criteria. So I think that's sort of where I was driving here, is that we get that language, we get comfortable with that language, and a project, kind of passes the test, then there's the ability to get kind of a market reward for that. And again, I think the second part of Mariana's question is about this 2003 deadline, but that's again just sort of related to how do we, what language are we going to settle on with eligibility criteria for hydro within the Connecticut RPS.
So, John, just for clarification, this proposal, if we were to include this in the report, would have to be accompanied by recommendations or considerations, I should say, to adjust the RPS to enable participation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess that you could argue there may be a couple of existing Connecticut Class 1 facilities that would qualify without adjustment. But I don't think that's the intent of what we're doing here. And again, that's an area where we should be thinking about appropriate tweaks to the language so that the guardrails are working the way they're intended.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have any additional questions based off of what John just kind of described and what Mariana had teed up? I think that's Laura from the car.
Yes, from the car with 2 dogs on top of me. Sorry about that. So I'll turn off this video. Yeah, John, what is the difference between the criteria in this versus like the low impact hydro certification?
I think that's a great question. And some of the language, the draft language that I recall seeing on how we would adjust class 1 sort of addresses some of the criteria that Leahy currently evaluates as part of their certification program. It's not clear to me if, Leahy becomes something that, becomes a Connecticut criteria or not, or if there needs to be some other, method to do this evaluation and who will be the arbiter of that, of those decisions. I think that's sort of an open question, but an important one.
Yeah, so then my only comment would be, if the low impact hydro certification, I assume folks like Duncan and other small hydros often have this certification. I wonder if that criteria is a little more stringent. Obviously, I'd like stronger guardrails or more established guardrails, but I'm less familiar with what the requirements are at a state level compared to them.
So I just want to just give a little bit of background. And I know we had talked about this in an earlier meeting, but there was, back in 2015, it was proposed to use Leahy as the standard for class 1. And at that time, the Low Impact Hydro Institute didn't have a lot of trust of the environmental community because it is a sort of a third-party nonprofit. I mean, I remain having concerns of while their certification may be strong now, the board changes over, the leadership changes over. We don't know what we're going to get 10 years from now. So I still have that caution, but maybe it's just maybe it's just from being around too long. I don't know, but that was the reasoning why Leahy wasn't used back in 2015 when they updated the class 1 renewable standards for hydropower.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think some other states do use Leahy, and Alicia, as you pointed out, there have been pretty significant changes to the program since 2015. And I guess the other thing I would say is just in terms of kind of the structure of compromise between kind of industry and environmental interests is that a lot of industry isn't really thrilled with Leahy either. It's like another layer of regulatory and kind of oversight that we already have. And it seems like there are concerns from the environmental group. So maybe that's actually the perfect fit, you know, something that all of us have reservations about.
I will say I can certainly see the concern with going third party certification. And I might be speaking out of school on this, but to I think Alicia's point, what's it look like in the future? Does, you know, if Leahy no longer can continue to exist at its current state, does it make sense for the state of Connecticut to actually have its own guardrails, very specifically set in statute, that's overseen by DEEP as opposed to going to a third party? But you know, that's something.
And I think the foundation of that concern is the public's ability to be able to weigh in on what that could look like, right? That there would be no public process around that if Leahy decides to change its certification standards. Whereas if the state were to change its standards for class 1, there is an opportunity for both, you know, the all stakeholders to come in and tell someone whether it's a good idea or not. I mean, whether that's an effective process all the time, no, but at least there's a public process around it.
Okay, no, you've definitely convinced me. Thanks.
I think the other thing, Alicia, just as an FYI, and again, this may be some 2015 legacy familiarity with the Leahy program, is that when they do make changes to their criteria in their handbook, it does go out to public comment before it's finalized and then rolled out. I know that, you know, full disclosure, I've been involved in Leahy. We have several Leahy certified projects, and they're in the process right now. There'll be a public comment period for new criteria associated with environmental justice and tribal consultation. So it is an evolving program. So your point about changes to the program is valid. The way I see it is the trend is to be more inclusive and comprehensive, and definitely, you know, kind of a science-based decision-making and evaluation process, which I think is appropriate.
I see your hand still up, Laura. Is that another hand or is that just legacy?
That's just because I'm in a car and I can't tell my hand's up. So let me see if I can figure out how to take it down.
No sweat. I'll call on Mariana while you do that.
I think the discussion around class 1 is important because I know there's concern there from a commerce clause perspective. And so I don't know that we're going to be able to get consensus around that. And so I want us to think, if we can't get consensus around that, are there other ways that we can think about eligibility of something like this that do not necessarily reference class 1? I don't have a good answer for what that could be. I know Leahy's been brought up, and that could be an alternative. But I have concerns about our ability to get there with the definition that we wanted on the class 1 because of the issues.
Yeah, I guess it was my understanding that, you know, I'll put this really simply, is that the state was sort of allergic to any potential litigation that might come from an interpretation of there being a Commerce Clause violation. Yes, I'm not really sure how you say that. Is that fair? And I'm just wondering, I know there was a lot of discussion between, I believe it was DEEP and the Green Bank and some of your council. There was some pretty significant like opinion paper that went out that seem to be like a little contradictory in terms of what states are doing and whether that's legal or not. So I don't know. I see Eric's hand up. I'll just see what he's got to say.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I don't know whether it's allergic or just expressing real concern that is open to legal challenge and may be hard. And of course, the context of all of these discussions that we're having about tariffs right now is colored by the article that was in the paper earlier about like Eversource asking for a 90% increase in rates, and I think we're just gonna have to figure out how if there's going to be an incentive for hydro specifically, whether it's done through something like a class 1 definition, which, as I totally agree with how Mariana put it, that there are issues there, or if it's more like the other thing that we'll talk about today, which is authorizing procurement specific to the effort. So anyway, I don't want to jump into that because I think this is a really good discussion we're having.
One thing I would caution, I think our group entirely is trying to predetermine, what the legislature should do. I mean, we should certainly offer up options, but to your point, Eric, I did read the article earlier today. I saw the Eversource news, and of course, that there are a lot of political ramifications and financial ramifications to ratepayers. I don't think it's within our purview to be able to figure out whether or not that's appropriate. I think the best we can do is put down, hey, these are the considerations we think would be viable to address the issues raised by the industry and by environmental NGOs, and you guys figure it out from there. I think is the way I think of it. But it's certainly it's something for us to think in the back of our heads. Is it a viable proposal? Some may be more viable than others.
I agree with you, Len, by the way. Thank you.
Duncan, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Very good. On the Commerce Clause thing, we got that article. I responded to that. In summary, I think I said that there's comment across the board, regionalization being done by all the states right now anyway, including Connecticut, when Connecticut says ISO New England. We're against the Commerce Clause just by saying that. Other states are doing in-state only. So I hope that we're not afraid of it. Let's just do it and try it and see where it goes. I mean, it's either that or open it up to all the states with class 1, which would cause a glut possibly with class 1. And why should we be paying out-of-state generators for our RPS requirements? So that's my take on Commerce Clause. Let's just do it and word it like other states word it, say the company, the distribution system of the company. The company is defined as the Connecticut Utilities, and we say distribution. We never say that word in Connecticut only, so it's not so loud, and other states are doing it. So I say, let's just give it a shot. Okay, now on criteria. Well, first of all, I want to just back up and say that I hope that everybody realizes that giving existing projects a better revenue, which is what we're talking about here, can only help these projects to install and manage a more environmentally safe and stewardship project. So I see an advantage, environmentally to giving these projects better rates. It's what could be a negative to it in terms of the environment regarding existing projects. Okay, for eligibility, Rhode Island says QF and RPS. We don't have to say that. We could put in a guardrail wording directly from the existing definition of class 1. I think that is better to work with that wording and work with DEP to work with LIHI, some third party. And that LIHI, by the way, we're against it. CSPPA does not like that. LIHI because it's very expensive. Also, it causes delay. It's just another, big roadblock to deal with. So I'm hoping that we can work with the existing guardrail wording and existing class 1 definition. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. I think, Mariana, I think you had your hand up before and took it down. I don't know if you want to jump in or not.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide if I should or not. And so I think I just want to respond to something, Duncan, on your sort of reaction about the class 1, where you just say, like, let's just go with it, and other states are doing it. And I think where we come at it as state and quasi-state agencies is that the concern is that we just do it. We don't just do it, right? Legislators decide to do it. And there is a challenge under the Commerce Clause. It leads to lawsuits, litigation, which ultimately probably sits on deep to have to figure out. And so there are consequences to just doing it, as you sort of mentioned, that I want us to be mindful of, and why some of us have reservations and concerns for that.
Correct me if I'm not mistaken. I think the Commerce Clause has been raised with other things that are outside of the industry somewhat recently with regard to tolls, for example, and the potential for if Connecticut were to install tolls, for example, we would lose significant federal highway funding and whatnot. So there are consequences to Commerce Clause violations that I know are relatively high profile. I'm not sure what it would mean in the energy sector, but nevertheless, I do share concerns that if we just ignoring Commerce Clause issues because it's convenient to do so could potentially create a problem. Going back to what Eric said earlier, I think, and our previous portion of this discussion, I don't know how viable that is for us to just throw it out there and say, well, I'll just do it, and the legislature take our report seriously if we're simply just saying ignore federal law.
If I recall, my quick review of the material that was provided on the Commerce Clause concern, is that there were some exceptions related to the type of service that was being provided. And I wonder if there's not, some criteria that we could lean on that that provided a protection against a challenge. Say a project was interconnected at the distribution level, an argument could be reasonably made that that asset provides kind of a load reduction service that's very localized and could not be provided by an out-of-state resource. So I think there's probably wiggle room within that law, or those, the way that that's written, that could provide an opportunity. But it's probably a pretty deep dive, and obviously, I think if we're going to get anything done, we really need support of deep in the state in general. So we'll need to just really address those concerns and make sure that the comfort level is there.
I was going to say if we include this in the report, and we include things like a reference to Connecticut specific or distribution specific resources for eligibility purposes, we could just very pointedly state that there may be Commerce Clause concerns that need to be addressed in whatever statute is put together. That might cover us and kind of, I don't want to say shove the onus on the legislature to figure it out, but frankly, they have a lot more resources from a legal perspective that could speak to this much more effectively than us together. So, Eric, I think I saw your hand up. You might have taken it down, but
yeah, I took it down only because you spoke exactly to what I was going to say. I mean, I agree 100%. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating that, the policy considerations that we're talking about shouldn't all be included in the final report, as long as in the discussion associated with them, we bring up, pros and cons as we're talking about now. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Duncan, go ahead.
You're on mute, Duncan.
I'll say it again, we're doing it anyway. We're doing it now. We're doing it with ISO New England. We're doing it with a solicitation proposal that we're considering indirectly by saying, show us your advantages to Connecticut's whatever, right, Mariana? So, in little ways, we're saying Connecticut only there. We could do that here also. We could, in this particular tariff one, we could put in a requirement that says, show me what you're doing good for Connecticut, right? So anyway, I hope we don't give up on this Commerce Clause thing to try to keep things Connecticut only, we can come up with some ingenious ideas on that and then just propose it and see where it goes. I understand your fear of lawsuits and all that, but you could get lawsuits with a solicitation right now, right? Because it's already saying, show us how you're improving Connecticut. Anyway, that's just a side note. Thank you.
Anybody else on this piece, the eligibility and whatnot? Kind of scrolling down a little bit so people could see it. If not, I might move to the next question that Mariana had posed, which is under the structure section that you'd proposed, John. How long is the agreement for? When does it expire? I think, I don't know if you've taken that into account.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we own a project in Rhode Island that was prior to we're net metering it now, but prior to that, we were under this tariff. And we had even though the statute says we'll have a contract, we just didn't have one, but we were still getting the rate. So I think it's a good question. I believe there's real value in having a contract. It's a little less powerful if there's not a specific rate structure within the contract. So, from my perspective, I would say, a longer term contract is usually better if I need to go and finance. But if it doesn't have a value associated with it, it's probably not that valuable. So again, this is a lot of borrowing from the Rhode Island program. This was basically their language, slightly modified. And I think there is an advantage to having a contract, but it's not clear, exactly how the rate and all those terms really kind of line up, given that there's a variability. Unless we were going to set like a floor and a ceiling, which is kind of what Vermont does, and that's not what we used here, but it provides a band with which kind of the value will be delivered in. So that's one way to think about this as well. Well, there's lots of knobs, I guess, is really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and sorry to jump in here just because it was my comment. I understand what you're saying, that if you don't have a rate, the value of the contract is not that high. But I do think knowing the term, how long you'll receive this incentive for, is valuable. So perhaps adding something around that, less focused on the agreement, but that it'll have a validity for X number of years is, I can see the value in that.
Yes, I agree. And again, I think, from an owner's perspective, the longer term is usually better. It gives you a little more confidence in making your investment decisions. So that could be open for discussion, but I would probably just start with a standard 20-year, agreement. Could be good adjustments from there. Again, Vermont uses a similar program where there is, I think their standard contract term is 10 years. But if you do a longer term, there's kind of a bonus adder to the rate. Same thing, like if you include, RECs, there's a little bit of an adder. If you're classified as a load reducer, there's an adder. So there's kind of this value stack that reflects different attributes of either the asset or the commercial terms.
Thanks, John. Duncan?
As far as contract term goes, we'd like it to be similar to the FERC license, which I think they're giving them away for 40 years now. I mean, the longer the better. Hydro is a long-term thing. Hydro lasts a long time, and we'd rather see longer rather than shorter. Back to criteria. I mean, we really didn't settle anything there. Where do we stand on, are we going to say hydro or all renewables? Where are we on size? Is it less than 3.5 megawatts? Where are we on in Connecticut? Where are we on putting in guardrail? Where are we on, is this for existing and or decommissioned and or unpowered? On the last one, I'm thinking existing and decommissioned and staying away from unpowered new, which I think would be more difficult to get agreement from everybody on. So how's everybody was saying that we're doing this for existing and decommission? Now, decommission is going to be hard to define those projects. They're on my list. I think there's 7 of them or something that are decommissioned. We have to come up with a definition for that, like decommission within the last X years or so, or still hold a current FERC license or something like that. But do I have any comments on would you like this for existing and decommissioned and not for unpowered? Where does everybody stand on that?
I'll jump in right off the bat. I think leaving new out of this is definitely well within our purview. I think if there are any potential new projects out there, which if I'll be surprised if there actually are, I think this doesn't really apply to them. I don't think, frankly, our task force is necessarily charged with addressing new build hydro. There are other programs out there for that sort of thing, and our focus is on the new on the existing. As far as decommissioned are concerned, there's a lot of different rabbit holes we can go down with decommissioned. I would be okay with just literally keeping this to existing resources that are currently under operation and have licenses and the ability to operate, but I'm certainly open to other opinions. I see Laura and then Alicia have their hands up. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, obviously we'd rather it stay to existing and not to decommission. Decommissions are kind of the definition of dams that are no longer making sense, and multiple dams on that list that Duncan gave out earlier are ones that are on the potential for removal right now or being removed. For example, like Kennytown, the Willimantic ones have been discussed, and there's 2 other on the list too that could be potential for removals. So,
thanks, Laura. Alicia?
So in regard to number 1 that we're looking at there, would this be for any class 1, not just hydro? Just a reminder that the definition in the class 1 for the renewable portfolio standards, there is a specific definition for hydropower. And so I'm assuming that's what we're looking at, right? Those definitions within the renewable portfolio standards. So that really, if that's what you're looking at, and that's what you probably would have to refer to that specific part of the RPS standards. But Laura, one thing I would say though is, and I'm going to go back to my Colebrook Dam example. Colebrook Dam was recently decommissioned, and it had to do with, well, a couple of things. First, it's not making financial sense for the MDC, and also they wanted to get out of their contract with the Army Corps of Engineers. But that's always been my sort of poster child for a dam that probably should be generating hydro, because it's an Army Corps flood control dam. It's not going anywhere. It's right behind another dam. And so I think I'd like to keep that example in mind, as you know, we're looking forward on this as sort of what are those projects that probably do make sense to generate hydro, and I would hate to see that excluded from potential generation.
And I can agree with that. Culver's a good example of one that 5 others on this exact same list that are potential for removal, are real candidates, one actively working on removal.
Does it make sense just to kind of jump in here on those issues? I mean, Alicia, you mentioned a dam that obviously isn't going to be coming down and serves another purpose entirely. Uh, I believe all of the qualifications that we've talked about, we've all kind of agreed, or at least we haven't objected to maintaining that threshold of dams that are being considered for removal, not qualifying. That would, in my mind, eliminate the bad decommission, such as a Kinney Town, which is being considered. And obviously, a Colebrook would, though it is decommissioned, it would be covered under the possibility of assistance, given the fact that that dam's not going anywhere. Is that a safe enough, I guess, compromise between decommissioned verbiage versus something else?
Well, yeah, I think that as the criteria currently stands with RPS, I mean, I think that utilizing that, it doesn't rule any of those out, right? And which is what you're saying, Len. But I also think that, you know, and again, we're not discounting anything, but you know, the whole proposal of DEP doing a request for proposals, you know, that would also be sorted through as well through the RPS process. So just thinking it's just a better process for weeding out the good and the bad. Letting the good through, weeding out the bad.
So essentially, it's DEP would be the arbiter there, would be the final judge and jury, which I think is currently how it's written in many different pieces of statute, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, I'm talking about a RPS specifically for small hydropower within Connecticut.
Yeah.
Which would get us around that 2003 date, right? Because it's outside of the RPS.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the wording, if you scroll down to Mariana's comments on the right column, you'll see the wording right out of definition of class 1, right? Can you scroll down, please?
Right here.
Right there, right there.
Yep.
Yeah, mine's chopped off by everybody's faces, but that has something like the word slated for removal by DEP. Is that right?
A dam identified by the Commissioner of Energy and Environmental Protection as a candidate for removal.
Right. So are you comfortable with that, Alicia and Laura?
I will say the 5 that I was talking about, that was in direct discussions with DEP. So yeah, that might be enough. I do agree. I'm sure with you, Duncan and Alicia, that there's this balance of ones that make a lot of sense, a lot more sense. And I think the other ones on your list here do. Often they're above the diagemus range or above a falls, or you know, or have an alternative use. So yeah, that might be enough, Duncan.
And I think I probably might be more comfortable with it if DEP had some sort of process for identifying
Yeah,
which
that's
dams
true.
are, you know, because
That's true.
DEP isn't necessarily doing all this dam removal work. It's a lot of NGOs. So if there was some way for DEP to be able to say, hey, let us know, we're going to put you on a list if you are, you know, actively investigating, you know, funding for a study for a dam removal, that sort of thing, or yeah.
That's
or
a good point. I will say there is another list now. There's the River Restoration Network. We coordinate with DEP on our list, but that's the group of NGOs that is kind of keeping now a list of potential candidates as well, too.
I was going to say, based on your back and forth there, Alicia and Laura, is that something? I know it's not. I don't think it's specifically in the document you sent around, Laura. Is that something we would want to include as a policy consideration, specifically DEP establishing better criteria or a specific process or something along those lines? I mean,
Yeah.
if it's missing, then we can
Yeah.
certainly address it as well.
Yeah, I would love DEP. I've been done. I mean, dam safety in New Hampshire has an entire staffer that is in charge of their dam removals at dam safety. And I have always been arguing not only for better enforcement at dam safety, but also potentially a position like that, or at least guidelines like this, and maybe a listing. Obviously, these can't be public lists, but yeah, I would like some criteria for that.
So Laura just said, sorry, Duncan, I'm just jumping in because deep was mentioned a few times in this, but Laura just said the magic words on, well, it can't be a public list. Well, if it's a list of deep, it's likely to be a public list, and there are complications around public disclosure laws, which are all for good reasons. So this is a complicated issue. I agree. It would be helpful were there clear criteria, that were worked on here. But I'd be glad to work with those of you who are interested on that topic to see if we can make some headway. But it's harder than just saying, well, there needs to be identification of this dam or hydro facility on a particular list before what's in the legislation would kick in. So it's anyway, we might have to live with how things are for a little while longer, but would be happy to work on this with folks outside of the task force process.
Go ahead, Duncan. Thanks, Eric.
This is great, everybody. We're making some headway here. I feel that we've got agreement that it looks okay to give better rates for existing hydro, and I hear that it's good to give better rates for some of the decommissioned projects. So we don't want to give incentive to projects that are so-called slated for removal or otherwise. So we need to find a way to define that clearly, more than just a piece of slate on a wall with somebody's chalk suggestions written on it. I mean, I'm almost at a point where, we're willing to just let Rivers Alliance and Save the Sound have a list. And if we're on their list, that project's on their list, then no, they don't get the incentive. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if it's possible to also be so bold as to list the projects in our report that we don't want to give incentive to, but I'm glad to hear the discussion, and this is good. And I think we made some general agreement there. What about the size? Are we going to have a size limitation here on this tariff
Before
structure?
we get to the size, Duncan, I would say that I don't think we can specifically identify certain projects in any list in this task force. I think that's not only outside of our purview, but yeah, I don't want to go there myself, just because there's a lot.
Two finger pointing, right?
That said, I think Laura had her hand up while you were speaking. So before we jump to the next.
Yeah, it's just real quick on what Eric said. The reason I said, and I totally agree with everything Eric just said. The reason why I said that is because a lot of times lists, let's say like the River Restoration Networks list, the owners haven't been approached yet, and you don't want to put them on a list and let them feel targeted if they've never been approached. We live in a country where private owners have the right to make their own decisions of what they're going to do on things. But if the state had a list, maybe if it wasn't called, something like that, but ones that have the most environmental potential if they were to be removed, instead of these are the ones we're targeting for removal. But maybe something like that, then things don't feel so targeted, and then maybe it could be public. But again, I agree, we're making progress. We ought to head on to some of the other issues. We don't have to dwell on this one too long.
Thanks,
I
Laura.
just put in
Go ahead.
one last suggestion. No, go ahead. I put my hand here.
No, I just said, yeah, go ahead.
Section 16-19 MM says in its review of ... the PURA shall consider the external costs and benefits of all proposed resources consistent with the state's energy and other policy and integrated resource planning principles. So that maybe gives DEP the ability to say yay or nay just right there. Anyway, that's just another thing that we could refer to possibly. 16-19 MM.
I'm not familiar with that, Duncan. I can't obviously take a look at that myself because I'm sharing my screen. But if you could send that around as just kind of a reference point for people to take a look at, that would be helpful. And to go back to your second portion of your comments there, you had brought up the criteria with regard to size. Did you want to finish that thought?
Well, CSPPA stance is that there's a validation of a cutoff of 3.5 megawatts for various reasons that are in my report. But, we're open to that as long as we do, CSPPA is Connecticut's small power producer. So there are reasons to promote these projects that are smaller. The bigger ones, a lot of them deal directly with ISO, or they do forward pricing or contracts or whatever that small projects can't do. So there are reasons to help out the little guys. But if somebody wants to make it higher than 3.5, we're not necessarily against that. Okay.
Go ahead, John.
Thanks. I think just relative to the capacity question, one of the benefits of this, of an outcome of this discussion and these efforts would be not only to provide, better economic assurance to existing projects that they can continue to provide the services and benefits, but that they would do that in a way that kind of also reflected enhanced environmental performance. And I think the majority of our in-state projects do fall under that 3.5 megawatt threshold. However, there are, and again, I'm not going to name names, but this group is probably familiar enough with Connecticut's resources to know that there are some projects that are over that are critical from an environmental, an ecosystem restoration perspective to make improvements that would have watershed scale, impacts and benefits. So I wonder if we don't just consider the manageability of our resource pool in Connecticut, being a small state with not a lot of hydropower projects, that would be even something to consider, and how that fits in with using this discussion as a way to actually enable and facilitate some of the environmental improvements that we'd like to see, and not excluding those projects which could have really significant environmental benefits if we were to get alignment.
Thanks, John. I can, now that you mentioned it, I can think of one specific project that would,
yeah, I bet you can,
benefit. It would greatly benefit. That does not include any of First Light's assets, but
I could too.
yeah, I'm not going to mention it, the specific names, but yeah, there are probably other instances as well that do fall into that equation. And I think the question it raises is what are you going to do with the money? If you had an opportunity to be assisted to maintain your operations and improve your operations, how are those ratepayer dollars going to be spent? Are there going to be guardrails around that? And this may fall into some of what Laura and Alicia may have referenced in some of what they've sent over that are on the agenda for a little later this afternoon. But nevertheless, that is a consideration that should be noted. Go ahead, Duncan.
Sorry.
We're talking about Derby and tunnel. Oh no, not tunnel. What's Stanley? Stanley
We're
works
not
with
naming names, Duncan.
Rimmon.
We're not naming
Rim-
names.
They didn't want to
Yeah,
name names.
we're not naming names. All right. Well, we're talking about a couple of 2 or 3 projects, right? And how they're going to use the money. Well, they're probably into relicensing and all the requirements and costs of that. So I think that would be probably well used by these projects, right? It's public information what the projects are, the size and all that. So I'm not afraid of what I just said on what projects are, but we're not, it's what we're doing. We're not trying to just singularly helping out certain projects, right? But I don't think we need to get into detail about how is the money going to be used. These projects would use the money for their relicensing. They would use it for better facilities. I know there's a ladder out there that EEP at the time required a slot ladder to be put in, and then they realized that it running, maybe you know more about this than me, Laura, that the slot ladder is not as good as a denial, perhaps. So maybe they could rip out the slot and put in a denial. But I think the money would be put to good use, and we're okay with increasing higher than 3.5 megawatts. Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
My dog just threw up on me, guys. So I was slightly distracted, but I think I'm okay.
I hope it wasn't the conversation.
Oh my gosh. Sorry.
This
Laura.
particular dog really, really doesn't like driving in cars.
Feel like we've all been there at some point.
Yeah.
Either with a baby or a dog, right?
Exactly.
Yep. Yep.
Or a friend.
Very, very true.
I guess this idea of like where would the money be spent and how that work, to me that comes to something that like Mariana was referencing in this the concept of a carrot versus a stick and how we develop these programs. If there were a mechanism that provided an incentive for an owner to realize a more beneficial rate and a better revenue stream from their projects that was conditioned upon kind of meeting some certain criteria, then that in and of itself could be, a way to just sort of make the table round here, right? And I think that there's probably quite a bit of potential there, is that you don't get these things unless you're making commitments, right? And you don't get to keep them unless you're doing what you said you would do, right? So to me, that's the way to how we get the hydro we want, is to realize that it's going to happen more efficiently through partnership and open dialogue. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, that's helpful, John. It makes sense to me, that approach. I don't know if anybody else has any other comments on that. If not, I'll simply state I think from my perspective, I do think it makes sense for us to offer up the ability under what John just kind of expounded upon, the ability for some larger facilities to qualify. I do think there should be a limit. I don't think, for example, a large facility like a Chippewa station should be covered under a program like this, at least not now. If that down the road it becomes a problem, it can be revisited, but I think there should be some kind of limit. That said, I think there are definitely some projects that would benefit ratepayers, the local environment, and those specific project owners at the same time with some kind of assistance. Go ahead, Duncan. You're on mute.
Okay, what do we think about a limit of 10 megawatts? I think we're doing the policy subcommittee work here, but we can put this off till later if we want to figure this out.
I think proposing something to the policy subcommittee that they can take back and kind of work the language around is probably the way we can approach this best. It's kind of a backwards way of doing it, but at the same time, I think it does give everybody a voice in some of these larger issues like size limitations and that sort of thing in a consideration we include in the report.
It feels like a lot of what we're talking about in terms of potential market mechanisms or programs really do pivot off of this question of what's eligible, what is the hydro we want. It's a really important conversation. And, you know, it seems like, I know there's a policy committee, but I wonder if that's not like a very specific sessions agenda to just really do a deep dive on that and try to get consensus. Because it just seems like everything that we're talking about builds off of what that is.
Well, if we're going to be referring to the RPS standards and definitions, right now that's at 60 megawatts. And, you know, dropping it down to 3.5 or 10, I don't think makes sense. It was 30 before it was up to 60. So if you're not going to use the RPS for eligibility, how do you incorporate the RPS standards and definition for hydropower into, you know, and change the size of the facility within this? It gets a little bit trickier. Maybe I'm a very much a bucket person and like to put things in different buckets.
To be clear,
have two things in two buckets here.
to be clear, I don't think we're recommending changing eligibility of a run-of-river hydro that currently exists. I think that's a different conversation. It's at 60 megawatts, which I think we've all talked about before. There are no 60 megawatt run-of-river hydros in New England at all.
Right. But what I'm saying is that if you're going to use the renewable portfolio standards definition as criteria for hydropower, how do you say you have that for eligibility, but then change the size because the size is within the RPS definition for hydropower?
I think for a specific tariff, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the concept was creating a almost a new subcategory for hydropower under a certain threshold that would be able to be eligible to qualify for this particular tariff program. So it wouldn't specifically be what a run-of-river class 1 is right now. It would be kind of a subcategory all in and of itself that creates an eligibility for this tariff. So it'd almost be a different, if you will, Alicia.
It gets its own bucket, but we haven't defined the bucket yet.
Yeah.
And I think that makes sense. Oh, Alicia, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was just shaking my head.
I thought you were saying something. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think because of the challenges that we might have with RPS, perhaps defining it in these policy considerations, what that bucket is, and adding some of the requirements, John, that you mentioned of sort of what we want hydro to have, allow us to sort of reach consensus.
Yeah, we don't have to necessarily even reference the RPS standards. I mean, if we recommend a consideration that they look at that creates an entirely new policy and program, it can have its own definition very specifically, you know, a small hydropower tariff program or something like that. And just, we could take pieces of the RPS definition, of course, and just kind of tailor it to, as John and Mariana just pointed out, you know, the hydro we want, as opposed to the way it's situated under the RPS. And I think that kind of makes sense too, to a degree, because there are other hydros out there that are smaller than 3.5 megawatts that don't qualify as a run-of-river hydro, and that's a different conversation, I think, but that's part of the consideration that goes into this as well. Duncan, go ahead.
Right, the way it's defined now, and I don't have it in front of me, is for a class 1 hydro, there's a Roman numeral 1 and a Roman numeral 2, I believe, and the Roman numeral 2 talks about 60 megawatts. We don't even know where that came from, but the policy subcommittee, we are looking at that and maybe asking to consider something other than 60. So what the policy subcommittee is considering is a Roman numeral 3 that would be small hydro without any date online limitation that would bring in the ones that can't get class 1 right now. A lot of those existing projects out there that don't qualify. So, Alicia, that's true that we do have that 60 megawatts, but it's only in Roman numeral 2. And we're proposing a Roman numeral 3. We want to keep a limit, maybe because we don't want to glut in the class 1 RECs. And that's why we're maybe keeping it to a limit, and also to keep it in Connecticut to prevent a glut. But we'll see how we can work all that out. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, I'm with you, Duncan, and I think because I think ideally we would have wanted to say under a certain amount and Connecticut only, because we might not be able to do Connecticut only. I think it makes sense to consider sort of a different bucket for these considerations in case we don't get there on the RPS, or even I think wherever we end up in our recommendations, but the legislature might not get there. And so we wouldn't want this to also not be able to include those projects that could benefit from it.
In terms of size limitations, I mean, it sounds, it's almost arbitrary to come up with a number. 3.5 megawatts makes sense for some, 10 megawatts makes sense for some others. Does it make sense for us to almost offer up the policy consideration and point out the fact that in our deliberations, some of these numbers are somewhat arbitrary or based off of current situations that we're aware of, that the legislature should take into account if they're to consider this policy as statute, how to come up with a reasonable size limitation that makes the most sense for the hydro, quote unquote, we want, as opposed to very specifically saying, oh no, we recommend it's got to be 10 megawatts or 3.5 or whatever it is. Does that make sense? I see your hand up, Eric.
It does make sense to me. I think it's going to be really hard to try to come up with a number that will be subject to a lot of criticism. That I think that falls into the category of perhaps needing additional study, or because I just don't see that we're going to be able to arrive at a number that works for everybody in the next few weeks.
It also strikes me as that I'm sure the public is going to want to weigh into this and in some way, shape, or form, and that's why they have not only public hearings if we can get it in there in time, but also legislators will talk to their constituents. So I would propose that we somewhat shy away from the size limitation, other than to say there should be a size limitation. It needs to be figured out. Does that sound reasonable to the group?
Yep.
I'd rather put a number in there and get on with the program myself, but that's just me talking. I think we can validate 3.5. I think we can validate 10 based on the resources that are out there.
What about,
maybe that's a subcommittee question?
I mean, I suppose we can continue to discuss it in subcommittee as well. I mean, it can continue to be hashed out. What I don't want to do is take up the whole meeting on this one specific issue and say it has to be this, when there could be some wiggle room left for the legislature to make that determination on their own. I think from a larger perspective, my one question I have is this proposal something that people are I don't want to say unanimous on, but essentially unanimous on going to the subcommittee to put together, to hone the language in such a way that it would be ready for a draft report.
You mean John's tariff here?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm all for it. Yep.
Eric, go ahead.
Just want to be really careful on this. Saying is there unanimous support? Yes, there is real interest in seeing how we can further craft this to fit what we might like to see, but it's for again, as a state agency, it's a little hard to say that we support this without having it go through some considerable internal review. But again, as a policy consideration with merit enough to include in the report, include pros and cons and discussion as needed. I'm comfortable with that.
To be clear, I wasn't asking for everybody to vote on, do you support this or not? It's more just, are we good with moving forward, putting this basically into the policy subcommittee for them to draft language that basically the state agencies can take back to their respective people and discuss and get closer to a final report.
Yeah, for that, I'm supportive for sure.
Same, supportive.
Any objections? Barring none, I am going to move that we, not to be so formal, but move that to. Oh, I see Stephen has his hand raised. I may have jumped the gun.
No, just want to clarify that Pura doesn't see itself as signing off or recommending any particular proposals at all. We're happy to help and assist the task force in getting to where they have some policies they want to recommend, but Pura doesn't see itself as advocating for any of them. Also, I just want to point out that some of these policies may have real impacts on ratepayers and the state, and it would be nice to be able to have these policies in detailed enough form so that the task force and Pura in particular has an opportunity to review those impacts and make sure that we're comfortable with where those are at.
Thank you, Stephen. I two questions for you. One, with regard to Pura's participation, I understand where you're coming from. Would it be preferential for there to be a very specific note that Pura is basically not taking a position on anything, what that the task force offers as a quote unquote consideration for the legislature to look at? Or, I mean, these are, I want to be clear, and at least from my perspective, these aren't things we're recommending they do. These are things that we're identifying that they can consider to address certain
Yeah, I
problems.
think having that language that Pura doesn't take a position on these policies, either to recommend or to say they're not good, I think would be appropriate.
Okay. Well, I think that's something we can certainly note. And I understand that the state agencies are and the Green Bank are in a more precarious situation than some of us from the private sector or from the NGO sector. So that said, I do want to be able to put together a report that actually is usable. And if we don't offer up any considerations, then it almost seems like we've wasted our time. Go ahead, Mariana.
Stevie, you said something about Pura's ability to comment on any on sort of the ratepayer effect of any considerations. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what that would look like? Like if we come up with a series of considerations, would Pura be putting something out as part of this report, or if called upon to testify? I think that would be sort of helpful to think through.
I guess I'm not sure exactly what the task force views as being includable in the report. It seems like there would need to be some discussion as to what the impacts of the various policies is, how much they cost, the doability. I think that's important information for the legislature to have. And I see that as a place where Pura can contribute, perhaps, with regard to the report. Also, I think Pura would want to know what these impacts are in terms of being in a position to testify if that comes up.
I think it would be difficult for us as a task force, given our resource limitations, to figure out how much something's going to cost the ratepayers. I know the legislature does have the Office of Fiscal Analysis that they can, if there is a bill that comes out of this, that they'll certainly run through OFA. And I'm sure Pura, I mean, you have resources, of course, that can take a look at some of these things, and that would be helpful if we can get it accomplished in the time frame. It may be a question of a public hearing question that comes out of the legislative process, which is if we were to consider, for example, this tariff proposal, what would it mean to ratepayers? I'm sure that'll be a huge question that'll come up right away. We'll need to, if we can address it as a task force in there, that's fantastic. I just don't see how we can possibly get that information out of this group, especially in that time frame.
Yeah, fair enough. Just seems like the sooner we can get the details around the proposals, the more opportunity we would have to have that kind of analysis and assessment.
Well, I think it would be helpful from my perspective for us to, if everybody's okay with it, I did just ask, can we move this to policy subcommittee? Maybe we can take what's written down here in that policy subcommittee and offer it up to Pura and see if you can, put some numbers around it. That might be, as quickly as we could possibly do it, that might be within the week. And if we can't get numbers to it, that's okay. In my mind, it's still a consideration that, the legislature has its process, and they may find that they don't have enough information this session, and they may have to move forward without it, or they may be able to get it done. I mean, that's not on us to figure that out. Go ahead, Eric.
Just want to make sure I understand what you were just saying, Lynn. Were you suggesting that it would be helpful analysis from Pura if they looked at the numbers that were provided in the Rhode Island example as a way of saying, if something like this were done in Connecticut using these same rates from the Rhode Island example, here's what we would anticipate the likely effect on consumers would be?
Generally speaking, yes. I mean, based on what we have here that we're reviewing now, if we could get that information, fantastic. I certainly don't think most of us in the task force can get that information. If anybody can, it may be Pura, which is why I just kind of referenced it. But I also look at our task force as being able to provide the information we have available to us in a manner that works for the legislature. And if it doesn't include specific dollar amounts to ratepayers and ratepayer impacts, they have ways to figure that out better than we do, in my mind, which may actually involve going to Pura. So, John, go ahead.
I appreciate this topic because it is important to understand the ratepayer impact. I think it'll be hard for anyone, whether it's Pura or anyone else, to do this analysis if they don't know what projects would be eligible. So we're back to this question. We're including 10 megawatt projects. We're limiting to 3.5 megawatt projects. There's an inventory of those projects right now in the state. Understanding the megawatt hour output from each one of those and how many of them might participate in this program is critical. It's a critical input to that analysis. Otherwise, it's just hand waving.
Mm-hmm. What would you suggest? I mean, can we have the policy subcommittee literally look at, okay, there is a finite amount of existing resources out there, look at it and see what makes the most sense in terms of a proposal. I mean, I don't see why that can't be done. I didn't want to be arbitrary about it, but I also didn't want to, I don't want to be unspecific enough where it's not helpful.
I wonder if Steve, I don't know. I mean, I guess I wonder, Steve, if you had specific inputs that you would need to complete the analysis. Maybe we could develop a tool that allowed some variables to be adjusted on the fly so we can kind of test ratepayer impacts.
Well, I think it's Len makes a good point that, or maybe it was you, John, about needing to know what projects are eligible under the various policy recommendations and what the likely impact would be on the pricing of RECs or other things. So I guess that would be kind of the information we would need, or at least be able to put some sort of brackets around so we could come up with a range of impacts that might might not be useful.
Go ahead, Duncan. You're on mute. You're on mute, Duncan.
Sorry. If it's existing projects, it's a finite list of projects that we all know about, and I sent that in an email today to everybody, my unverified lists. If it's decommissioned, we should be able to narrow that down and kind of know which ones would be considered and not. And then it's just the kilowatt hours average per year of those times the rate and whatever impact that is. So we can certainly provide some of that information on a journey towards determining ratepayer impact. If we're doing a solicitation, maybe that includes new unpowered projects, and that's yet to be determined. Frankly, I don't believe there's going to be many, even with a very attractive rate, that would be developed in Connecticut. The only one that I can tell you that is in the works is Andy Pecklow's Pomperod project. Otherwise, I don't think there's going to be much there, but we could help out somewhat in this ratepayer impact thing, but I think we can only go so far with it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think Duncan makes a good point. I'd be interested if this is doable to look at existing projects. I'm less comfortable looking at decommissioned or others, but just for giving a ballpark, looking at existing projects on Duncan's list and what the ratepayer impact is likely to be, I think is useful.
In that case, I would move that the policy subcommittee take this, try to draft some of these specific some of the specific language here, and take into consideration the existing resources that are out there. Bring it back to the larger group, so that maybe we can potentially. I don't want to say, well, maybe we can vote on it to go into a draft report for consideration by Deep, Pura, Green Bank, et cetera. Possibly get Pura on the case of trying to find a financial impact as well. So just to move forward, I think I know we have about half an hour left in our scheduled time here, but just to move forward, it doesn't seem like there's objections to considering this policy initiative. We just need to get more information, which the policy subcommittee can do. Any objections to that? Barring none, I'm going to move to the next one, which actually is a tariff proposal offered by Duncan. And I'm going to ask Duncan, do you want to move forward with your tariff proposal? Are you comfortable with what we just discussed through John's and just leave that off the table? What do you want to do? There are some differences, so.
Right, I'm comfortable with John's. It's got more detail. It's got a precedent of being in Rhode Island, and mine was more or less based on Representative Steinberg's bill last year. So mine was just small summary. So John's is good, and I'm good with just going with his for now.
Okay. Then moving off of that one, the third policy consideration I had actually was offered up by Laura a while back. She had sent a white paper around. I know she's in the car. Now, I'm going to ask Laura, what's your preference? Do you want to start covering this week, or do you want to?
I definitely would not. It's not really policy recommendations as much as guardrails. So I would think if we could get to Eric's proposal, that would be a good one.
That would be the procurement, which I think I listed as Mariana's, but you're right, Eric was the one who brought it up first.
No. I think Mariana should be the one to present it. I think she's done the most work on it and has some a thoughtful way of putting it forward. If you'd like to do that, Mariana.
Nope, that's the wrong one. I'm sorry. I'm trying to find it here. Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, happy to do so, and Eric, jump in at any point. So language was shared. about including as a policy consideration to have a legislatively mandated procurement of in-state hydropower resources. And this language is based off an existing section 16A-3H of the statute, which called for solicitation of a few resources, including run-of-the-river hydropower and others. And so we can, I hope folks have had a chance to review because it was shared ahead of time, and you will see that there are things I've called out for discussion with the group, such as who it should be administered by, if DEEP or the utilities. And Eric, I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
My preference would be if this were to be authorized, that it be DEEP rather than the EDCs who are doing the procurement, and that has been the recent trend. It also would of course involve an agency that has specific familiarity with hydropower and the benefits and environmental concerns that we've well discussed, and often those procurements or perhaps always those procurements are done not just by DEEP, but there is work with EDCs as a part of that too, and I should mention that we do have some specific language suggestions based on what Mariana put forward there that we'll share offline, and maybe that becomes another conversation point for the policy subcommittee to take a look at. But that would certainly be my preference, Mariana, that it's DEEP leading that procurement.
I would echo that. I think that's
so.
pretty consistent across New England as well. It's not just Connecticut that's kind of switched it up from a procurement standpoint, that the EDCs are no longer the lead, if you will. Go ahead, Duncan.
Right, talking about in-state. So this one, sections 5 and 6 kind of put some preference on projects that do have positive impacts on the state's economic development and goals that are consistent with policy goals outlined in comprehensive energy strategy. So that kind of addresses the in-state only. Is there a size requirement here? That's wide open, I guess, right?
Yeah, there wouldn't, the way it's drafted, there is no size requirement, but there is something about so the number of megawatts, a minimum number of megawatts, and a date by when the solicitation needs to be issued.
Right, for a total.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the way that those are typically done is also it's an up to number. So if let's say it was 30 megawatts or 40 megawatts, it would be giving the authority to DEEP to work with EDCs to do a procurement of up to a certain amount.
Right. So
It's
this would be
more up to unless at least.
Yeah.
right. So this would be a bidding system. And how often would this happen, or that's yet to be determined? Is it annually, or how does that happen?
Typically with these types of proposals, or at least in some of the other procurement statutes that are out there, they have a certain authority to get up to a certain amount. So for example, the offshore wind, they have a certain amount of offshore wind that they can procure, after which they can't get anything else without additional authority given to them by the legislature. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mariana or Eric, I think that this would be somewhat similar.
Right. So as we know, hydro was different than other renewables in many ways. It's defined by the location is already there, and then there's the FERC licensing requirement that's very lengthy. So RFPs are sometimes hard for hydro, but perhaps it can be done if the developer feels confident that he or she can get FERC license and then get win a bid. would a FERC license be required in order to put in a bid? Or can it be done in parallel? What's required, land ownership or some kind of
So if you go down, let's see,
I think 10.
Is it 10?
10 shall meet applicable state and federal requirements. So that
Including
would require,
safety, water
Yeah.
quality and fish passage. This section here.
right, just talking about our requirements, but not talking about showing a certain level of development, whether the developer has a FERC license in place or whether the developer has land security in place. That's not being required here.
It doesn't sound like it. That would be, applicable state and federal requirements, essentially, if they're in compliance with whoever their regulator is. That's the way
Are you recommending that those be added, Duncan?
No, I'd rather it not, so that those can be done in parallels. I'm just curious. Thank you. All right.
I think John has a hand up.
He does, yep.
Thanks. First of all, I appreciate this work. I think it's an interesting concept that could really be beneficial. My only concern is that I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure that this doesn't address the issue of getting away from status quo. Now, particularly from the environmental interests who are looking for changes to projects that require significant investment. The way I read this, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you already have to be compliant with these significant kind of capital investments or operational criteria in order to qualify. So I wonder again if there's not some sort of conditionality that allows that kind of recognizes that this type of award under this solicitation of this nature could be used to help kind of maybe work with the Green Bank to get financing to do the work that makes you eligible, right? Because again, I think this is an opportunity for us to advance and modernize the fleet and give life extension benefits, but we have to structure it the right way so that it actually can do that.
I'll just say I think we would be open to seeing how to best do that, because I think there is an interest in, if investments are going to be made, that they, not just be rewarding those that are all operating, to do quote unquote doing the right thing, but using it as a way to encourage those that may be close or maybe willing, but short of funding to be able to get there. I think that interest is there. So happy to work with you. And maybe that's also, if folks wanted to make a specific recommendation around that, be open to it.
Yeah, John, I think it's a good suggestion. I would welcome comments in terms of maybe perhaps we can change that room, that number 10 to say that proposal shall meet or have plans to meet, or show some sort of action plan to meet state and federal requirements, something along those lines.
Looks like Alicia's had her hand up for a minute or two. You there, Alicia?
Mute. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. I never know whether to lower my hand first or hit mute first, and I'm always paralyzed for a minute there. Anyway, so is 8 necessary here?
The brownfield, it probably is not. If we're creating a separate procurement from what is already in statute. This is based off of section 16A3H. It sounds like we're talking about a separate procurement entirely. That wouldn't, I don't think, apply.
Yeah, and that is to that point, one of the comments that we had to tweak that text for sure.
Yeah.
And I would be really interested to see any language coming forth, because I definitely see Joe's point, and I'm wondering if there's some way in 10 to put in there that, that a facility, selected facility, has to be in compliance with blah, blah, blah within whatever reasonable amount of time it is to get there. But John's point's well taken.
Go ahead, Duncan.
But I think the concern that John mentioned about having to have compliance in place before you bid is not written here. I think the key word here, like in number 10, it says the proposal. So it's your proposal that you're showing shows that you're going to be doing this, that, and that. So I think it's okay the way it's worded in that respect, and unless I'm wrong here. Thank you.
It is a good point, Duncan. I think it may need some massaging, but it does very specifically state the proposal. I think this specific language is probably designed for, things like new build and that sort of thing. But it does need massaging in my mind. But I think you're right to a degree that it's somewhat covered the yeah. I don't know if anybody sees it that way.
I agree. I think it while it could cover it, it could be open to interpretation. So I think there's opportunity for improvement in the language.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Thanks. Maybe it's in here and I missed it, but I'm just curious what the contemplated tenure of a contract would be, or an award would be. Seems like the rate is going to be competitive, so it's just wondering if there's kind of a ceiling price or a floor price, what that looks like, and how long. Basically the basic principal terms of what you win here if you're successful in the solicitation. How long is the contract? What's the at least range of value? And what are the products being delivered?
Yeah, and I think some of that, John, is sort of the balance between legislatively mandating that or that being outlined in the actual RFP proposal. And like the solicitation. And so sort of taking from other language, and specifically that section 16A-3H, that wasn't specifically outlined in statute.
I know that long-term contracts are generally defined in statute. I forget what it is in Connecticut. It might be 15 to 20 years. So if it is in there, that would be that's most typical that you see 15, 20 years, something in that range. But it may be something that, it looks like Steve's got, he may have some insight into this. I didn't see it in there, but go ahead, Steve.
Button.
Yeah, you might be on mute, Steve.
You with us, Steve?
Sent him a little note to unmute.
Yeah.
Maybe he raised his hand by mistake.
That could be. It could be. Well, we can come back to Steve, but it's generally, I think it's 15 to 20 years in Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken.
He said he can't unmute.
Oh, okay. Well, that's odd. And I can't unmute him myself. So apparently we're stuck here. I think just to kind of move the conversation forward, I think we could certainly add some definition here. Oh, it looks like
it was frozen on me there. Just a clarification. I think as I read this, there's language here that says that commissioners shall select proposals for at least a certain amount, but the solicitation itself appears to be like a may, not a shall. So I don't know if that's purposeful here, but I just wanted to clarify that nothing as it's written right now, as I read it, requires the solicitation to take place, but if a solicitation should take place, it's then requiring a certain amount be procured. So just not that may be well understood, but just wanted to clarify that.
I think it's a great point, Steve. I think at the beginning it should say shall instead of may. And that would line it up with the bottom portion, which talks a little bit more about specifics about size and date, which I think would be important. And I'd want to get folks' thoughts on. I know people have said, folks here have said up to instead of a minimum of. But those I think are two key things so that there's sort of line of sight of how much is being procured and by when.
Alicia, I see your hand up.
I would use caution and make sure that we're not putting DEP in a position where they have to do a solicitation that does not make economic sense or meet our clean energy goals.
In what way, Alicia?
Well, I mean, looking at, impacts, if DEP is going to be looking at things like impacts on ratepayers, what's available to meet clean energy goals, and, the any sort of cost of an incentive, it may not make financial sense to do a solicitation. And then we're using agency resources, requiring them to do a solicitation for, and I'm not sure how, how often this needs to be done, but what if it just doesn't make financial sense in the future for DEP to solicit hydropower within the state? I'm just throwing that out there.
If we did just hypothetically, if it was a single procurement, okay, there's going to be a procurement for existing hydropower to essentially get it through the transition and continue to operate into the future, including doing some of the things that John had mentioned, such as getting some of these other facilities that are not necessarily up to snuff right now, getting them up to proper environmental mitigation and whatnot. Essentially what it would, I mean, if you did that once and it's a long-term contract, you do it once and that's it for some period of time, whether it's 15 or 20 years. And then if it's something that's necessary again down the road, that's for other people to figure out. I think from whether or not it makes sense financially for the state, I think that comes into play regardless of what policy considerations they take into account. I mean, that's part of what I think Puro was trying to reference here. What is the ratepayer impact? I mean, we don't know exactly this group right now. Maybe we can find that information before our reports do. Maybe we can't. But that's, again, I think something that the legislature can look into much more deeply than we can. I think if I understand you correctly, I think the big concern is adding the shall instead of the may. The concern from the industry side, I would imagine, would be that if you leave the may in there, they're just going to sit on it and never do anything, which happens sometimes.
You're being generous, Len.
I agree with changing the may to the shall, and I think that was part of the suggestion of also including a date on there of when this should take place. So I mean, I know folks, including ourselves, are resource constrained, and so it helps to allocate resources if there's these requirements.
Any other thoughts on just generally speaking the procurement concept itself? I know it definitely it needs some language massaging, which I think the policy subcommittee could probably do pretty well, especially based off of some of the earlier conversation we had with the tariff for eligibility requirements and that sort of thing. I think can can certainly be integrated into this as well. This is just a different, in my mind, just a different mechanism of addressing some of the same issues that we've already identified. But looking for other comments or anything else that anybody might have. Okay. I'm going to propose that we move this to the policy subcommittee as well to try to tailor some language here. And I do want to mention, we already kind of just skipped over it, but Laura had addressed her paper that she had sent that I shared again the other day as including guardrails. I think that's something in my mind that needs to be taken into account as we put these two proposals together and add some language to them that's more tailored. I think the guardrails in my mind make a lot of sense to include as much as we can, and I think the policy subcommittee should probably use that as a guiding reference. But I also don't want to skip over a conversation about that. So I think what I'm trying to get to is, our next meeting, there are probably a couple other proposals that we haven't talked about. One of which I was going to send out this coming week. Probably not as deep of a conversation as some of the others, but nevertheless, there's going to be a couple of those, and we haven't really talked about the guardrails in detail. Is that something we want to tee up on the agenda first thing next week? Or I guess the question too for Alicia and Laura, are you comfortable with our conversation to date?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean Laura may have a different thoughts on how to move forward, but once the policy committee has looked at these and made their changes, I think it's easy enough to see whether those guardrails are in place once that sort of a final draft of the policy comes out. So far it seems like what we have said should remain in place has been incorporated into this, but it's just a matter of what ends up coming out of the policy subcommittee. So
Thank you. Duncan.
Right, the paper by Laura is good. We've yet to discuss it as a group if we want to. But earlier on, we talked about the whole structure of this report we're doing, and we all agreed that these papers, like my study and Laura's paper and so on, would be added as appendices. That still holds, right?
That's my intention, yes.
And then there's a subcommittee called environmental, and they only have one section to do, although it's an important section called drawbacks and environmental impacts. So we'll be seeing something coming out of that subcommittee, right? So
Yes.
looking at Laura, having Laura's paper that we're going to be looking at, we're just doing that to talk about that section, drawbacks, environmental impacts, or we're looking at that to try to incorporate that into policy.
I would say incorporating that into the policy considerations as well as, and obviously if there's contention, we can discuss it as a larger group. But I think that at least that was my approach was taking the guardrails, so to speak, that Laura had provided and leveraging those in the policy considerations that we put forth.
Yes, that's what I was thinking too. They weren't related to the impacts and the benefits. On the impacts and benefits, Alicia has been working on that, and I'm going to be helping her work on that too. So we will have something, but we also haven't discussed that with others in that environmental group.
And I did want to revisit just very briefly. I know that we mentioned it a while back earlier today. There is we talked about a deep process for dam removal. That is, I mean, in my mind, there are policy considerations with regard to that sort of thing too. I don't want to leave that on the side and just ignore it. So I would say if for next meeting, if Laura or Alicia, if you have any specific thoughts on that, possibly getting into a proposal, I'd welcome it. I think that would be something to have a conversation about as well. But just let me know how you want to proceed. So we'll put everything on the agenda for next week.
Okay.
And then, as I said, I don't want to stall out any other conversations. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up on the procurement before we move to public comment?
Len, I'm jumping in, not necessarily on the procurement, but one thing
Mhm.
that would be helpful before we sign up. And not everybody needs to be here is understanding within the policy subcommittee how we're gonna sort of take this to the next level, given the tight time frame here.
That's a good point, Mariana. I think there's what, 4 of us or 5 of us total that are planning to meet. I think does somebody want to be the quote unquote cat herder for that particular subcommittee, or
I mean, I think Duncan already is unofficially. But I guess, Len, part of what I wanted to propose here, and I don't know if it's doable within this structure or shortly thereafter, is for us to maybe just hop on a quick call once we're done, if we have time, where folks have 5 minutes, and just hash out what needs to happen next and who's gonna do what, if that works.
I'm happy to throw a quick teams together and send it out to those of us who are on the subcommittee and try to put something together for right after this. So
I'm already late for a meeting that started at 2. So
A
I
little
may or may not be able to join that, but can maybe, if it's a Teams meeting, can at least see the texting.
sounds good. We'll put together something. And Eric, if you have specific dates or times that are terrible for you next week, let us know.
Monday's really bad for me.
Monday's really bad for me too. So okay, we'll figure something out.
Eric,
Does
the
it-
rule is that whoever's not in the room, we just assign everything to them, so.
I know, I'm worried about that.
is there any public comment? If not, I think our next date and time for meeting is next week on Friday at 1. And Abby, I would just ask you if you can, if you could set the Zoom sometime around Wednesday for that, and then I can send an agenda either Wednesday afternoon or Thursday morning, depending on what we get in, which makes sure that we're getting the agenda in before the 24-hour notice cutoff. And I see Stephen, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to let the group know that I won't be here for the next meeting on Friday, the 23rd, but Quat Win will be covering the group task force for Pura. He won't necessarily be able to respond in real time to the group's questions or whatever, but if you could just pass on anything you need from Pura to him, he'll be able to pass it on to the appropriate people.
Thank you, Stephen. All right. Well, with that, I'll adjourn. Everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
Brian. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.